Good evening, everybody. My name's Michael Frater. I'm the Rector of UNSW Canberra at the Australian Defence Force Academy. Before I do the welcomes, can I just remind everybody to please turn off their mobile phones? And I'd like to begin by welcoming the Honourable Tim Fischer, who is our guest of honour this evening, who will be talking to us. Also welcome His Excellency Major General Dunn, the New Zealand High Commissioner, and His Excellency Mr Guterres, the Ambassador from Timor-Leste. The Acting President and Vice-Chancellor of UNSW, Professor Richard Henry, Rear Admiral James Goldrick, Air Vice-Marshal Brian Weston, Commodore Di Pietro, representing Chief of Navy, Air Commodore Roberton, representing Chief of Air Force, Commodore Cater, Adfa Commandant, and Brigadier Lures, Commandant RMC. We also have with us this evening representatives from the British High Commission, the US Embassy, the Royal Belgian Embassy and the Embassy of Italy. It's my privilege to welcome everybody this evening to the 2012 University Lecture. This is an annual series of lectures designed to inform officer cadets and midshipmen about issues and concepts that are not a formal part of the academic curricula. This plays an integral role in providing a broader understanding of the world and important issues of the day. We invite speakers that will motivate, inspire and hopefully even challenge the way you think about broader social and political environment and your role in it. As the future leaders of the Australian Defence Force, exposure to these ideas will expand the breadth of your intellectual viewpoint and assist you in developing as a leader and a person. With this in mind, it's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening, the Honourable Tim Fischer. Tim has had a remarkable career, and that's one of those things that we fairly routinely say in introducing speakers, but is particularly true of tonight's speaker. Given his background in political life, international issues, industrial and social life. Mr Fischer started his career in the Australian Army and served in the Vietnam War. He then had a distinguished political career in the Australian state and federal parliaments spanning 30 years. He led the National Party of Australia for 9 years and served both as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Trade in the Howard government. He led the official Australian delegation overseas during the independence referendum ballot held in East Timor in 1999. In 2008, Mr Fischer was appointed Australia's first ambassador to the Holy See, where he served until earlier this year. He was made a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering in 2001 and is noted as a tireless advocate for rail transport, and that's one of the issues that he's going to touch on in his speech today. He also has a wide range of other interests, including agriculture, international trade and transport interests. He's been Chairman of Tourism Australia and of the Australia-Thailand Institute. In 2005, he was made a Companion of the Order of Australia. He's also had a very long involvement in charity work, including the St Vincent de Paul Society and the Fred Hollows Foundation. He's also an author and has hosted radio programs. Tonight, Tim Fischer is going to talk to us about diplomats and defence attaches in the 21st century, high-speed diplomacy and high-speed rail. Would you join with me in welcoming him?
Thank you very much, Professor Michael Frater, for those very kind words of introductions. Your Excellencies, including General Martin Dunn from New Zealand and friend Abel Guterres from Dili in Timor-Leste, Professor Richard Henry from the UNSW and Commodore Bruce Kafer, Commandant of ADFA here. Ladies and gentlemen, and a special mention to two other people, Brigadier Lures, who commands Kapuka, where I first entered the Australian Army. And he also tells me he commands Canberra, a place I never wish to return to ever again, and Duntroon. And Officer Cadet Ryan, who tells me he wants to fly Hercules around the Riverina, but would actually prefer to go in something faster. To all the Officer Cadets, I wish you the very best. And it's a great privilege to deliver the 2012 UNSW Canberra Atttache Lecture. It is good to return to Canberra, where my wife Judy and I happily rented a house in Forest for a year or two last century. I had an impossible dream, you might say, to live in number 10 Downing Street. Now that was not possible. So the second best was to live in number 10 Hobart Avenue, which we rented. Problem, just like Duntroon House, it also was haunted. Doc Evatt, former Leader of the Opposition, former Minister of the Australian Government, died in that very house. And there was no way that he was going to allow a Conservative Deputy Prime Minister to have a decent night's sleep any night in his first 2 years as being Deputy PM of this country. I want to salute those who have entered diplomatic training and those who have entered the Navy, Army and Air Force officer training, officer cadets here tonight. Perhaps some of you may end up in South Sudan, where the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade sent me in June for a final specific task, and to Eritrea. The truth is, this is a fast-moving 21st century. The truth is, you may end up anywhere in the world on short or very short posting, special tasks, specific tasks, or indeed on longer-term postings. As we go through the burial of 5 tremendous Australian soldiers lost just a few days ago in Afghanistan, I think those of us who are guests here tonight should put our hands together to the officer cadets and wish them well wherever you go in your careers. Let me say I returned from a posting as Ambassador to the Holy See in Rome a lot wiser, a little bit wearier, stimulated and uplifted, but with the very best definition of diplomacy you are going to hear anywhere, anytime soon. It comes back to just 4 words, dare I say: protocol, vitriol, alcohol, and after a big day, Panadol. There's a lot more than that attached to it. I've encountered many incidents of high-speed consular and diplomatic activity which have to be handled in the knowledge that there are instant, minute-by-minute news reports beating the news of events back to Canberra, back to Washington or wherever, sometimes by social media and, of course, by the likes of the ABC, BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera and all the other networks. Indeed, it's even reached a stage where Barry Humphries, fumbling with his mobile phone on Q&A, had gone viral before that particular program of Q&A had been completed on ABC TV. A really good example of high-speed events unfolding is the saga which unfolded on Friday the 13th of January this year, when the captain of the Costa Concordia cruise ship rediscovered well-marked rocks which had been mapped for over 500 years just off the coast of Italy, steaming 2 hours northwest of the port of Rome. It was about 9 o'clock on that Friday night. It's now known that there was a blonde lady on the bridge of the Costa Concordia assisting the captain, perhaps. It is now known that the captain had a good friend on the shore of the fishing village nearby. Suddenly there was a screeching sound reflecting the impact of the ship's hulls with the rocks. Then a period of drift for about 45 minutes, and then things rapidly deteriorated, and 32 people are still unaccounted for. Our consul in Rome, Jenny Hobbs, Australian A-Base staff, sprang into action well before midnight, and along with locally engaged and very dedicated staff, really dedicated staff, they were quickly on the move to Porto Stefano, the mainland port where the survivors were expected to come ashore after dawn. Better still, our consular staff, who were part of our embassy to Italy, as opposed to the embassy to the Holy See, the embassy to Italy, led now by David Ritchie, used good local networking to obtain the manifest. This is critical. To obtain the manifest of everybody who was on board the Costa Concordia by 8 o'clock on that Saturday morning. It revealed that there were 23 Australian citizens on the Costa Concordia, middle of January, a long way from home. We knew that because we went back to Civitavecchio and to the Deputy Harbour Master, and the team had the local knowledge to, in fact, execute this. They set up in a barista and local coffee shop near the main wharf at Porto Stefano. They hung the Australian flag out the front, and cop this, by lunchtime on the Saturday, 21 of the 23 Australians had been met, accounted for, assisted, passport issue commenced, and contact back to their families in Australia, as the news was all over the world that the Costa Concordia had tilted on its side and had been evacuated. By sunset, the last 2 Australians had been found, and the whole process commenced of taking them back to Rome and the like. Now, I want to say this was high-speed consular activity and success at its very best. When you think about it, off the coast of Italy, a Friday night, not a Thursday night, a Friday night, the middle of winter, a long way from Australia, and 23 out of us, 23 Australians accounted for within a few hours. I'm pleased to say that ex-Consul of Rome, Jenny Hobbs, is with us here tonight, and I think she and her team also deserve a round of applause on high-speed consular activity. There she is. Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Secretary Dennis Richardson points out often that we have about 100 locations where we have Australians, where we have posts overseas, of various kinds. Sometimes it's Austrade only at Vladivostok, very busy this last week. We've just reopened or opened in Lima, Peru, an embassy. And as a minimum, 100 posts overseas is close to the minimum, in my view, for a middle power nation of 22 million people today. So what is the role of a modern diplomat, more broadly today, and specifically the role of a defence attaché? And of course, many of you heading to the Navy, Army and Air Force are thinking, that's the last thing I want to be, a defence attaché. I want to command the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, clearly the best battalion. I can understand you wanting to command that battalion. I want to command real live units. And yet I've got to say to you, to all of you, and to the outsiders, guests here today, the role of a defence attaché is more important today than ever before. And there are new rules around the ridges, networks this century, compared with, say, 100 years ago, which diplomats and defence attachés have got to take into account. And let's just work through these rules quickly. Rule 1, do not clog up the cable reporting system repeating an account of events that have already been covered by the various news networks. You're not helping anybody simply to report that Costa Concordia had tilted on its side, sank on that particular Friday night. But you do help if in reporting back you have something to say which has a discerning observation, or you seek to highlight a ramification that might not be readily recognised by DFAT headquarters or in the centrum of government in Canberra or Britain or Washington or Wellington, as the case may be. In other words, make your cables relevant and not just a repeat of the last 24 hours news cycle from something that's happened in the country where you are posted. My first Easter in Rome led to a round of huge events, addresses by the Pope, 3-4 hour services, a brilliant Last Supper Mass in St John Lateran and so forth. But I wanted to send a cable to Canberra, and I wanted it to be of substance, and I wanted it to be noticed. Halfway through one of the long masses, the papal preacher, Canela Messa, burst into English and said, and I quote, "There may not be a God, so enjoy life while you can." This in the middle of St Peter's Basilica. I thought, we have a very defiant preacher here. This is going to get interesting. And he, of course, was referring to the slogans on the side of the London buses at the time, which was going through one of those Richard Dawkins campaigns or whatever, Christopher Hitchens, and it was making this point on the side of the buses. And he said, before you get too critical, perhaps we should pause and think that it has at least elevated the debate over God, the discussion of God, and where society is heading, and perhaps it therefore fulfilled a purpose. Now, the real purpose of my cable was to alert Canberra that the Pope was about to go to make a very sensitive visit to the Middle East, to Jordan, to Israel, to Lebanon, and to the West Bank, I should say. He's in Lebanon this particular week, this next couple of days. So I could not resist, because the title of the cable are 7 or 8 words and then goes ... So back came my cable to Canberra from the Australian Embassy to the Holy See in Rome. It simply said, "Holy See, colon. There may not be a God, ... It certainly raised a few eyebrows. But it had a point to make, and it's no use reporting back for the sake of reporting an event which is already on the BBC World Service or whatever. You report back if you have a point to make which is of relevance, which is of guidance, which is a discerning observation. Rule 2 in this modern high-speed world of high-speed diplomacy is simply stated. And I think my friends from New Zealand and East Timor and others would agree, you have to do more with less. Do a lot more with a lot less resources. Post the GFC, and as the baby boomers switch from net revenue creators or taxpayers to government and become instead net takers from government, all levels of government need to maximise use of scarce finite resources. The days of embassies having grand banquets are not over, and neither should there be. They are part of the tools of trade. But the key is to ensure a good level of Australian sponsorship to ease costs and create a win-win outcome. Faced with 8,000 Australians coming to Rome for the canonisation of Mary MacKillop, who opened her first school at Penola in 1866, I knew I'd have to put on several official functions. My hard-working small staff, and so I got very busy. And I wrote to every winery in the Coonawarra, just near Penola, thank God, where Mary MacKillop had opened her first school, and said, you might like to send 12 bottles to Rome. Well, a miracle occurred. Many dozen bottles were sent by each winery, and I thanked them all. And every ABC broadcast I did from Rome during that period, I said, the great Coonawarra has donated all this wine. It is wonderful. They donated so much wine, damn it, I had to leave some behind in the safe when I came back from Rome in February. My successor is now enjoying, it's a bit like loaves and fishes, it just goes on and on, it's still not drunk out. A win-win situation. The cost of the functions I held during the canonisation and in the last 18 months of my posting greatly lowered. The impact of those functions greatly boosted, and a free plug for Australian wines in Rome, in Italy being one of the, by volume, biggest wine-producing nations in the world. Let me just say as an aside, the consignment arrived at Genoa, not the wise port, was vanished to Milan, a long way from Rome, and I'm delighted Antonia de Ring's in the audience today because she led the search parties that found where our shipment had been snuck off to and ensured it got to Rome ahead of the canonisation. But that sort of sponsorship is now par for the course. You are going to have to do a lot more if you are the defence attaché in Manila, Philippines, or wherever you might be posted as a battalion commander in the Sinai or the lot, with, frankly, a lot less resources. And the third rule on this pragmatic level is no longer can an ambassador bury themselves, if they ever did, in their golf or books or whatever. They have an extra overarching remit in this competitive world to promote the profile of their country, promote investment, and, of course, promote inbound tourism. Oh, to be the French ambassador, Stéphane Romatet, who at this moment is enjoying the massive publicity that's being drawn to the Napoleon exhibition in the NGV in Melbourne. That's the sort of thing that you milk every which way if you're a French ambassador in Australia, or the Spanish ambassador and the Prado exhibition in Brisbane. So this is now the fast-moving face of the various, perhaps less formal dimensions of being an ambassador. But underlying all this is the geopolitical strategic set of policies which matter for Australia today, and for Australia in 50 years' time, and for Australia in 100 years' time, and the long-term alliances and the like. And yes, whilst there are guidelines and rules and strategies for dealing with the fast-moving, one rule I would highlight and detail re our strategic policy settings is a very simple one, an overarching one which I think you're probably taught a good deal about here at ADFA, and that is to need to think long-term and take a long-term approach with so much of what is defined as diplomacy in the 21st century. For example, Australia closed an embassy in Copenhagen in the mid-1990s. We opened it again 4 years later. The net extra cost to government from that degree of silliness was $3 to $4 million. It should never have been closed in the first place. And of course, now with Princess Mary of Tasmania, dare I say, living in Copenhagen, Denmark, it's very unlikely that any Australian government will be closing that embassy ever again. But also, you have to do more with less. You have to think long term. You have to reach out to up-and-coming members and senators, ministers and other key people in countries of priority for Australia. And you do that in the defence realm as well as more broadly the elected officials and the like, especially with regard to Asia. When I first entered the Australian Federal Parliament in 1984, I nominated Thailand for detailed contact, detailed study, and to meet the younger MPs, helped by then Ambassador Richard Smith to Bangkok. So I got to know very well Consular Kankigi, who went on to become Deputy Prime Minister when I became Deputy Prime Minister. I could pick up the telephone to him. Dr Surin Pitsawan, who's now the Secretary-General of ASEAN. Both of those have been to my farm and electorate in the Riverina, and I've been to their electorates in Thailand, and I did all that when I was a junior backbencher before I went up the ladder and before they went up the ladder. Invaluable. And then I spread on to build those sort of contacts in the Himalayan Kingdom of Bhutan for particular reasons. Perhaps we could answer that in question time. This was invaluable liaison. And likewise, the various outreach trips Australian federal members of Parliament are prone to make, especially to the Middle East, are useful, so long as the sponsored ones involving free travel are declared and represent an even-handed program and just not a mere token 2 hours on the West Bank. There is, I might say, a scope for a thoughtful thesis to be written on the cumulative effect and impact of the overseas sponsored travel of Australian federal members of Parliament, most notably to the Middle East. It is a matter of public interest, it is a matter of public knowledge, and it certainly impacts on the Australian government policy settings, the Australian Parliament's policy settings and attitudes over decades with regard to the Middle East. So I want to say, in going long term, this is particularly important with defence attaché positions. They should not be spread too thinly or yanked out of Rome, as was the case in 2009, just when the Mediterranean caught fire, just ahead of the cauldron that became Tunisia, government overthrown, Libya, civil war, Gaddafi slaughtered, Egypt, complete uprising with the Copt minority Christians being attacked and their churches burnt down, and with some Muslims helping to defend that Copt minority themselves also being slaughtered in that dreadful situation. And yet what did we do? We pulled out our defence attaché from Rome, and our defence attaché for Egypt and the Sinai, and most of you know your geography, is located where? Madrid, Spain. And yes, is a naval person. I think you're too senior for that particular position. But I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, you can spread too thinly when you have that situation with all that's happened in the Mediterranean in the course of the last couple of years. But defence attachés, let's dwell on that for a moment. They are vital. They carry out enormous work. As Libya collapsed, we had to get Australians out of Tripoli, and the Consul General Tom Yates was flat out driving people to and from the airport, to and from the wharfs, and the ferries, including the Maria Dolores built by Austral in Perth, was doing the fast run across to Malta, where our defence attaché team and Ambassador Anne Quinane was meeting the hundreds of businessmen and others working on mining projects and the like that had to get out of Libya very quickly indeed. There was one businessman who went missing. He'd been arrested by the regime. Tom Yates put a lot of effort in. Minister Rudd put a lot of effort in. And this is where things can be very fast-moving, very sensitive, very delicate. But history records, with the help of Turkey, he was flown out of Tripoli just in time and is now safe and sound. It's a great pity that the occasional person who feels that they didn't get quite adequate service will dominate the ABC News headlines as Tripoli collapsed at that particular time, not that many months ago, rather than coverage of the hundreds of Australians who were safely processed through Malta and elsewhere and helped out of Egypt, out of Tunisia, out of Libya, and in 2006 out of Lebanon during that particular summer war. And indeed, the same could be said, to be very specific, that this sort of work by defence attaches and close with consular staff can unfold very quickly and means you need to have fast-moving teams to bring about outcomes that matter and rescue those Australians. Ken Brownrigg, however, played a slightly different role in East Timor after the ballot was taken, which I had the privilege of observing, when East Timor voted 78% to 22% to become independent of Indonesia. And with that announcement, all hell broke loose in Dili and Timor-Leste, a lot of fires, a lot of shooting. The compound of the UN was surrounded. For a couple of weeks there were negotiations before Interfet went in. There was only one Australian that went through that whole period, protected, would you believe, by an Indonesian army platoon. His name was Ken Brownrigg, still working and serving here in Canberra. Cut a long story short, Ken rang Peter Cosgrove in Darwin just 8 hours before the insertion of Interfet into East Timor, the Thai Singapore-Australian International Force, and said, "Sir, I think you might like to think about your order of battle insertion. I think it might be better to come by Hercules, because Hercules are flying in and out every day, than at 4 a.m. by Black Hawk helicopters and people in black uniforms coming down ropes, which will probably excite the forces around the Dili airport and lead to a shooting incident or set of shooting incidents." History records that General Cosgrove, in his wisdom, took the advice of Ken Brownrigg on the spot, cancelled, much to the fury of the SAS at the time, the Black Hawk insertion. The Interfet forces went in by Hercules, and by sunset had secured Dili and secured the airport. Defence attaches in real time can and do play enormous roles, and I'm pleased to say the Defence Department and Minister Smith has not so long ago split off South Africa from India, so we now have a defence attaché in Johannesburg or Pretoria, as well as in New Delhi, and that's the case should be. And the same might apply to Minister Councillor Agriculture. We had Travis Power in Rome, and these people do a lot of good work on behalf of Australia. So I reiterate, the need exists to go long-term in our diplomatic approach in so many ways. To not pull in and out of countries. When we open an embassy, we stay. Lima, Peru, one of our most recent embassies, or be it the smaller ones such as in Zagreb in Croatia, all doing vital work in their own ways, and the various Austrade offices as well. Yes, we should move quickly and respond quickly when circumstances arise, but in terms of an overall strategic approach to our diplomatic work, our campaign for the United Nations Security Council at this time, and a raft of other issues. The SKA radio telescope, which is now in part going to Western Australia, following a decision earlier this year, those representations are best done on a long-haul basis, on a long-term strategic, holistic approach. That is the way you'll succeed in what is, of course, a high-speed, moving, fast-moving 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here in Canberra tonight. And yes, I had to drive 3.5 hours from my farm near Albury-Wodonga to be in Canberra tonight because there was no high-speed rail TGV type train which would have offered me a 45-minute service to a hub station in front of the casino where there's a car park tailor-made for the central new hub high-speed rail station here or out at the airport or both for a TGV type service, Melbourne, Tullamarine, Albury, Canberra, Moss Vale, Sydney, Newcastle, Coffs Harbour, Gold Coast, Brisbane. I close on the matter of high-speed rail and remind you that Field Marshal Herbert Horatio Kitchener came to this country 100 years ago and wrote a famous report on the railways of Australia. And he said in his report, funny about this, But it would seem that the railways of Australia are designed to help the enemy invade rather than Australia defend. He was right. It's now many years, it's nearly 5 decades since Japan commenced operating the Shinkansen back in 1964 on standard gauge 4 foot 8.5, the same as the Melbourne tram tracks, the same as Fishwick, Queanbeyan, Bungendore, Goulburn on a good day when that train operates. Not one fatality. They've had earthquakes in Japan, they shut down within 60 seconds. They've had tsunamis, not one fatality in the operations of the Shinkansen since 1964. At lunch today, the French ambassador reminds me that the TGV has been running commercially since 1981. 0 fatalities. Sadly, 1 or 2 of the other systems I see in Germany, 1 or 2, but in terms of the safety and the mileage covered at the speed covered, incredible safety records. The Italian Red Arrow, the Italian system is so damn good, you now have a choice of operators on the main trunk route Rome-Milan, and it's dropped 3.5 hours when I first got to Rome to just 2 hours 55 minutes from Rome Termini or Tiburtina to Milano way up in the north through mountain ranges, and yet we still have not got an HSR. Dr Paul Wild's scheme was for a high-speed rail through Canberra in time for the Sydney Olympics. It needs boldness. It needs a vision on both sides of the federal parliament. And I welcome the fact that there is a second report now commissioned by Minister Anthony Albanese, being done by ACOM, looking at further detailed aspects of the possibility of building a high-speed rail. And I've written a book, Trains Unlimited in the 21st Century, ABC Books, which shows the sort of timetable whereby you could leave Canberra at 7 a.m. in the morning and be in Melbourne by 8:45. You could leave Canberra at 7:20 in the morning and be at Sydney Central, not Mascot, Sydney Central Railway Station by 8:20 a.m, 1 hour later. It is now or never for high-speed rail in Australia. On this corridor where there's over 10 million people living, and which is and embraces one of the busiest city pairs anywhere in the world. Between Melbourne and Sydney is, I think, the 5th biggest city pair for passenger traffic in the world. Some would argue we don't have the 60 million that is necessary for high-speed rail like France or like Italy. But we actually have 22 million people, half of whom live broadly on this corridor. And do they like to travel? They travel exponentially and look to alternatives with regard to that travel. Let me just briefly canvass the reasons against, then for, building a TGV or high-speed rail down under. Against, the cost, initial start-up corridor purchase costs and total construction costs. Can we afford this? Is it the best right priority in these economic times? Well, some would add we do not have the population base. In fact, I would argue that we do. 4. Firstly, high-speed rail would eliminate the immediate need for a second Sydney Basin airport for at least 2 generations, if not forever. And remember, 2/3 of the flights this day to and from Mascot were simply to service destinations along the Melbourne-Brisbane corridor. And in Europe, the moment you drop down below 3 hours, 3/4 of the traffic migrate from aeroplanes to their preferred way of travelling by high-speed rail. Secondly, it would greatly ease congestion on key arterial roads and on the actual trunk Hume Highway and Pacific Highway. And conversely, do not build a high-speed rail, and then before long, costly 8-lane freeways and highways are going to be necessary, most notably between Sydney and Newcastle. I mean, look at the strategic exposure, the risk factor, where there's only one decent bridge out of the northern approach of Sydney across the Hawkesbury and one very old railway bridge, an old railway tunnel. For what, 4 or 5 million people and another 500,000 people beyond? We are very exposed in the absence of high-speed rail in this country and on that corridor. Thirdly, there is a proven halo effect where you would bring about decentralisation at the hub stations, such as if there was one at Benalla, if there's one at Albury, if there's one at Tumut or near Tumut, between Tumut and Wagga, at Moss Vale. Not every train would stop at those stations. Some would be the through-running trains, but go look at Lyon and see what has happened there since 1981 and the advent of high-speed rail. Fourth, high-speed rail would engender a massive reduction in carbon footprint, with meeting the transport needs of the majority of the population of Australia along this corridor, thus meeting in part the needs of population far beyond the corridor when they need to travel Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. Fifth, whilst it could be dubbed of looking after the well-off and the mobile, including thousands of football fans, it should be noted that transport efficiency within the Australian economy is important. Our economy is only as productive as the efficiency of our transport links, road, rail and air, freight and passenger. For some reason, we have not yet proceeded to adopt high-speed rail, even though it's existed for over 50 years in a very practical and workable way. We are in many ways sabotaging our true productivity for the Australian economy in this particularly important corridor by so doing. So, ladies and gentlemen, how do you pay for it? Well, perhaps in question time we might cover a bit more of that. But I met a few very rich Italians, and I know a few richer Indians, and they want something called an SPQR, a Roll Gold Visa, a special permanent quota residency visa, the ability to come to Australia at midnight, stay a few months, come back out again. And they're prepared to put $1 million, up to $5 million, into infrastructure bonds and $10,000 a day to process their immigration applications so they can do that with their families. It is already happening by degrees at a state level under the radar screen, but Minister Chris Bowen has alluded to this recently and wanting to make a coordinated approach to bring those sort of people into this country, but they pay for the privilege. United States of America, if you want a green ticket, you happen to have a lazy $500,000 and put that into municipal bonds in the USA, you get your entry permit very quickly indeed. There are other ways, I won't dwell on them, let me simply say we're at a crossroads on transport productivity in this country. It will limit our growth and our economic growth. It would be a huge boost to decentralisation. It is my hope that the next Parliament, after the next federal elections next year, will address high-speed rail once and for all and proceed with the consideration of the ACOM report 1 and 2 by that particular time. I could go on, but relax. The details are in my book, and I would just say that my son Harrison often has a jab at me, again this morning, and says, "Dad, why are you so interested in high-speed rail?" And I quote him exactly, "Dad, you will not live long enough to see it." I could cut him out of my will. I am an optimist, so I do look forward to seeing you all on a high-speed train, Canberra, Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne, Canberra, Brisbane, or whatever, sooner rather than later. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the chance to deliver UNSW Canberra ADFA Lecture 2012. It is a changing world. It is in many ways a brutal world. It is certainly a very fast-moving world. And diplomats, defence attaches and all of us have to learn to live with that. We'll do that best if we take a longer-term approach and build for the future in a strategic, holistic, long-term way.
Mr. Fischer will take questions, and I think we have a couple of roving microphones. Yes.
Oscar Jones. To what extent is a long-term strategic perspective in regards to diplomacy undermined by internal domestic short-term political ambitions and pressures?
I think that's a good question. Half Officer Cadet Jones, 10 push-ups in the morning. It's a very accurate dissection of the dilemma any government, any parliament faces with the limited resources, how to do more with less, how to pay a productivity dividend out of Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and still maintain enough service to provide a tremendous service to 23 Australians coming off the Costa Concordia earlier this year, or whatever the case might be, death of a footballer in Vegas and the consular services which have stepped forward with regard to that sad event last week. It's about balance, it's about setting priorities, and it's about leadership. And I think that we are an insular nation, and we at times lose sight of the importance of our direct links and relations with New Zealand, with Papua New Guinea, with East Timor, with Indonesia, our littoral area. But you get the balance right if you have good strategic thinking in your leadership, and if you have the bureaucracy of Canberra stepping forward, and whatever the crisis that governments face with big fishing trawlers or whatever, they are still there giving the right advice, highlighting what's coming up, which is of exposure to Australia, and working closely with our neighbours on a raft of issues. And that can even include the bravery of St Kilda and the Sydney Swans venturing to New Zealand next Anzac Day to play the first ever match in that country overseas for fair dinkum points for the AFL. So you put two things. You maintain a balance, a set of priorities and focus, and for all that Cabinet might be dealing with the issue of the day, we had meetings of the National Security Committee of Federal Cabinet when I was Deputy Prime Minister, where all other business was pushed aside during the course of the parliamentary sitting fortnight. And things were a bit quieter around the Parliament House. You'd have a strong meeting, attended often by several senior personnel in uniform, and you'd be looking at quite complex issues with regard to Asia, most notably, or even things such as diverting an aircraft flying with equipment for the commercial mercenary soldiers that were operating for Sandline at the time in Papua New Guinea in real time, and that plane with its equipment, it's a matter of public record, was intercepted between Malaysia and Papua New Guinea and diverted to Catherine, Tyndall, and in a hot hangar way down that runway in the middle of the Northern Territory there are some rusting Russian helicopters to this day. I think they're still there. They'll never fly again, I can tell you. All the rubber's perished off them last time I looked. So that's a very specific example. But you do it by maintaining a balance, maintaining a focus on priorities, and having the right structure, such as the National Security Committee of the Federal Cabinet, to ensure that that is delivered as the nation deals with and as the Parliament deals with the particular issues of the day.
Good evening, sir. Chairman Leonard. You mentioned in your speech the value of forward thinking. With that in mind, what advice would you give to a midshipman officer who would harbour ambitions of a diplomatic career further down the road?
Just repeat the second part of your question a little more slowly because of the acoustics.
Sir, what advice would you give to a midshipman officer who harbours ambitions of a diplomatic career further down their career track?
Well, the first thing I'd say, as we discussed with Commandant Luz of Duntroon and beyond, the role of Defence Attache perhaps over the years has dropped off because it's not seen as a direct command. It's not seen as 500 men and women under command doing Projects X, Operation Y, meeting Remit Z. And yet, in many ways, it has its own challenges, it has its own operational dimensions. It can often involve being able to speak several languages would be a help as well, and you just never know when a defence attaché has to step forward in very awkward circumstances, but also regular circumstances, such as the construction of the 2 naval ships at the moment in Spain, one already delivered, or one already launched, I should say, and very heavy workload for our defence attaché Holt House, now just been succeeded in Madrid, quite apart from everything else he has to cover from that position in Madrid, as I mentioned earlier. My advice to you is to rate more highly the prospect of one day being a defence attaché. My advice to you is, nevertheless, first and foremost, build the foundation blocks, and that is getting through the courses here, the university degree here, UNSW, and doing whatever your first or second postings are with great energy, great professionalism, in a true spirit of Anzac, and great purpose. I think you are getting some of the very best training in facilities which are a fraction dated, as we've learnt, but not that bad, and a whole lot better than Canberra, which awaits you. So all I would say to you is, if I, as a son of a farmer from Boree Creek in the middle of the Riverina, 1 hour west of Kapuka, can go into the army, go through National Service Officer Training Unit Skyville, become a second lieutenant, albeit never rise beyond that, but go on to become Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, I'll tell you what I thank. I thank my family, my education in Boree Creek and Melbourne, but above all else, my faith, but I also put right up there is my military training in so many ways, not the least of which is the ability to schedule, to prioritise man management, and the raft of other skill sets that you will get as you work towards graduation and through your first set of junior postings. The fact that I never rose above the rank of second lieutenant is probably a good thing for the Australian Army at the time, but it happened because of a very simple fact. I decided to march out of 1 RAR after going to Vietnam and all that, because the very next day I knew Jeff Kennett was marching into 1 RAR.
And on that note, I'm going to invite Professor Richard Henry, the Acting Vice-Chancellor of the University of New South Wales, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael. This evening in the university calendar is always a great one, and we've been privileged over the years to have a series of great speakers, and tonight is no exception. Politicians and former politicians are always accused, and sometimes rightly, of having more style than substance. I don't think that's an accusation that could be made about Tim Fischer. There's certainly no problem with the style, but there's a lot of substance, and it's wonderful to hear that oration tonight. In the interest of continuing with the substance, rather than me merely giving a vote of thanks, the little sample bag that I've been carrying around all evening, I will now hand over to Tim Fischer as an indication of the thanks on behalf of the university for this oration.
Thank you, Richard.
Very good.